All right, so
I apologize for last week's hiatus. Hopefully, expect everyone's watched those videos the video I posted is mainly kind of looking at discrimination. So we had like 3 types: employer, employee, and then consumer discrimination. Kind of thinking about how all those things might impact the groups that we're being discriminated against. So we'll kind of do a little bit more of that today. Kind of paint it in the light of gender discrimination, and then we'll also think about kind of transitioning into talking about college athletics and some of the different issues that arise there.
so I've got the lectures for this week up here. Also, the paper for this week will be kind of on coaching, the NFL coach discrimination. So we'll be talking about that Friday. I'll probably do a little more Excel work on Wednesday and Friday this week as well to kind of run some regressions and start getting a little more familiar with those. But for today, I'm going to start out talking about gender discrimination. So I think we'll look at different types, each of those 3: consumer, employee, employer. But a lot of the times when we're trying to identify gender discrimination in sport, it's difficult to do analysis if there's not mixed competition, right? So if you have solely male, solely female leagues, those leagues may operate very differently. They may generate different amounts of revenue, and so it's hard to kind of compare across leagues whether or not we have discrimination going on. Now, if we have mixed participants, then it's a little bit easier, right? So these don't often occur, so it's hard. There's not a lot of studies on this. There's been a couple, like in the PGA, we've got some more women represented. But is the lack of women a result of discrimination or something else, right? Well, I mean, I think that we go into the fairness of whatever it is, but if there's high quality enough female athletes, they're going to find a way into these male sports. And in fact, I just saw there was some first NCAA Division I female baseball player. I think I'm trying to remember the school and I can't, but it just happened like this past year. So absent of discrimination, what would we expect to be true about maybe these different wages paid to women versus men and female versus male leagues? So we just kind of look at some of the evidence, right? Even the WNBA, we're looking at kind of similarities to minor league baseball, right? So attendance isn't a perfect measure, but when we're thinking about what wages should be, we'll go back to our labor market depiction. So we've got quantity of labor, we've got our wage on the y-axis. Zoom in a little bit here. There we go. Maybe a little bit more. All right. So let's assume for a second that we have the exact same supply of male and female labor. Okay. And I'm going to use. I'll write it down here. So remember, demand for labor comes from 2 things, right? We said it's the value of the additional wins a player brings in, which is really the marginal revenue per win times the marginal wins coming from labor. So let's assume that we take the best WNBA, the best NBA player, and let's assume they're adding the same number of wins to the team that they're joining, right? However, what's probably true about the marginal revenue per win, and we're using attendance as some evidence of this. I guess the ticket prices could be much higher, but there's similar venues, right? So if the attendance is much lower than the WNBA, what we'd expect is probably true about the marginal revenue per win. It's probably lower, right? They're generating less revenue for each game that they're playing. For each additional win is going to generate less revenue in the WNBA as opposed to the NBA. So when we're thinking about that, our kind of female demand for labor, or the WNBA here, if we wanted to use more acronyms here, should be much lower than the demand for labor for males, right? Or for the in the NBA, right? What's that going to predict?
So we're going to expect to see kind of fewer females, right? Or fewer female teams, fewer female players, smaller roster sizes. We're also going to be thinking about, we would expect to see lower wages. So that's not to say that there isn't discrimination going on, right? This is what would occur if there was no discrimination. Now let's, for whatever reason, assume consumers are discriminatory, right? And they don't like to watch women play sports, or, you know, some, you know, hill jack, you know, anything else, right? So what could be true is, well, what does that consumer discrimination do? It adds in this additional cost, right? So that demand, right, the value the player brings in is now whatever revenue they were generating, but it also they incur this additional cost because, you know, they actually did hire, you know, if they actually did watch the sport, they don't, you know, enjoy it. So we're gonna think about, actually, sorry, that would be if it was that would be if we had employer discrimination, right? They incur additional cost. If it's consumer discrimination, all that's going to do is drive down the marginal revenue per win, right? It operates in a very similar way. Both of them would decrease that demand curve. So with the discrimination, maybe we end up with wages that are even lower than they should be. So even if we have differences across male-female leagues in the marginal revenue generated, there still could be discrimination going on. And it's even harder for us to really pick it up, right? Because if we look at the marginal revenue when it's lower, we know the wages should be lower. But that discrimination could be pushing them even lower than what they should be, right? Or you could also do a model where, I think my marker's dying on me, so I'm going to switch to green here. Let's assume instead that we had a different sport, right? I'll do, I think it's figure skating. If you look at like the amount of money that the female athletes earn is much, much higher. So you can kind of think about there, maybe for whatever reason, the demand for the males in that sport, it's figure skating, it could be any sport that we're thinking about, that for whatever reason, demand for females is much higher, right? It could be operating through the marginal revenue per win, that for whatever reason, more, you know, actually another really good one would be like, I was blown away. I looked at the numbers once. I guess like cheerleading is like this, competitive cheerleading is like this really big thing, like that people spend tons of money on. And there's like competitive cheer people in college that make like buco bucks, right? And it's specifically female, right? So we know there's gonna be this demand difference, right? But what could happen if we have consumer discrimination going on, even in something where the females in the sport are generating more revenue, right? The demand should be higher for their labor. So we know that we should be seeing this gap in wages. But if we've got some discrimination going on, right, by consumers or by the employers, right, both would shift that demand curve down. And we may see, yeah, it might look like there's no discrimination because the female athletes are earning higher wages, but in fact, they should be earning wages even higher than they are. Right? So this is kind of the flip of the previous example. Now, if discrimination gets large enough, then we can start to identify discrimination because, you know, let's say, I don't know, people really are discriminatory and it pushed the wages to be lower. And then we look at the actual revenue numbers and we're like, well, why are female figure skaters getting paid way less than males when they're generating way more revenue? In fact, like I think you could do this. I think that they might have, I forget what happened with the case now, but women's soccer, when they were like having a lot of success, if you actually looked at some of the revenue or some of the TV views, they're pretty high relative to the male team, right? And they were still earning significantly lower wages. Now, part of that was like the way that they negotiated their contracts. But the idea there is if I do have evidence that the marginal revenue is greater for those female athletes, and I still see that they have lower wages, I know there's some type of discrimination going on. Now, maybe this is not from the employers, maybe it's coming from consumers, right? And so
If it's coming from consumers, I generally can kind of, it kind of gets masked, because if consumers are discriminatory, what that really does is drive down the marginal revenue per win. And so then when I look at the revenue numbers, I'm like, well, yeah, the female sport isn't generating as much revenue, but it could be a result of consumer discrimination. If it's employer discrimination, it's a lot easier to identify, because with employer discrimination, this is the one that I actually showed you earlier, the marginal revenue per win, if I look at the revenue data, will still be high. It's just that this additional cost that the employer is incurring because they're discriminatory against this person is going to be driving that wage down. So I can identify employer discrimination a lot easier than I can identify consumer discrimination, right? Any questions over anything? Okay. Let's see. So, I'm looking at just using attendance as kind of a rough estimate of going to be some indicator that revenue is going to be higher in these sports. I would also expect which of these to kind of have some of the higher salaries. Probably the sport with the highest attendance, right? So NFL here, I probably expected it to be pretty high. Now there's other things that come into play, right? In the sense that Major League Baseball is 162 games. So any one player, if I'm playing more games, might have a higher number of additional wins that they can add, right? Just by the sheer fact that there are more games, right? But we can kind of think about sports that have the similar number of games, right? Where we're probably seeing kind of the number of wins added kind of similar between the two sports. So maybe like NHL, NBA, we expect maybe wages to be kind of more similar there. Now, what we would actually need is not just attendance data, right? So we have here, we look at the data, I think go back when we saw that NBA was higher than the NHL by quite a bit. So why? Because their attendance, even though their attendance is very similar and they play the same number of games, why might we still see wages be higher in the NBA? It's not just the number of tickets sold. Prices. Yeah, prices, right? If I'm meeting capacity, right? If I have higher demand, I'm not going to see the attendance go up, right? That was where we had those vertical supply curves, but I'll see the price that tickets are selling for go up. Total revenue is price one. Okay? So attendance isn't perfect, but it's a kind of a place to start. Right? So we kind of already went through some of this. If we look at some of the revenue, especially like NBA, WNBA is probably the best comparison of a female male league that we have. And we just see that the overall TV views, merchandise, apparel sales are all much lower, right? So we kind of already went through all this. There are some exceptions I kind of mentioned. So yeah, figure skating, gymnastics. When we look at wages, we see females earn more money. And then when we look at tennis, we actually see that the female and male tennis TV views, at least, are very, very similar. So we would expect, wages to be a lot more similar for female and male tennis players. And if they aren't, well, then maybe we're concerned that we have some discrimination. And then also I kind of use Ronda Rousey, kind of an old reference. But, at the height of her fame, she was earning significantly higher, wages or amount per fight than some of the male athletes. Well, why was that? We kind of think about here, it gets a little bit weird, but like in the UFC, it's not like you're adding a number of additional wins to the team, but how much money are you generating for the company? Well, if you, for whatever reason, fans really like you and you're really high quality, right? You're kind of thinking about, you would expect that demand for too much higher, driving up the wage for that individual. So quality plays a role, but also just, part of this, and especially when we're thinking about individual level sports, this is why it's, I would argue, especially with social media, more and more important that people gain kind of these large followings, because if you have a larger following, people are going to be more likely to buy your jersey, buy a ticket, whatever it is, and you're going to bring in a higher additional amount of revenue than a counterpart who doesn't have that following. Right? So I've never seen anyone do this, but an interesting thing to do would be look at like UFC fighters, if you get some evidence on how much they'd be paid for each fight, and then looking at like their social media followings, I would expect there's probably pretty high positive correlation there, right? Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay.
So some other interesting evidence, I trying to find this, I had this paper. We might take a look at it for this week. It's not gonna be the one I expect you to read. But it was on male and female coaches in NCAA basketball. So if we just look at NCAA basketball, male coaches earn quite a bit more than female coaches. So what's one thing that could explain that? I'm not concerned with whether it's men's or women's basketball. Why am I, if I'm just looking at NCAA basketball, I see male coaches be paid much higher than female coaches?
Return on investment.
So that's true, but where is that coming from? If I had 50% male and female coaches in both women's and men's basketball, then I shouldn't expect to see any difference, right? So the fact that I have more males represented in men's basketball, and I have way more females represented as coaches in women's basketball. Well, if the women's basketball is generating less money, right, lower marginal revenue per win, the demand curve for women's head coaches, regardless of the gender of the coach, is going to be much lower, right? So what would be better to do is compare male and female coaches within the same division, right? So we don't have really, I think at some of the lower levels are some female coaches in basketball, but if we looked at women's basketball, we have a lot more kind of, or a higher percent, or sorry, a more similar proportion, right? There's more male coaches in women's basketball than there's women coaches in men's basketball, right? So what we expect, who do you think would make more there? I mean, I don't, it takes a variety of different directions. Maybe here, if you're a male coach in women's basketball, maybe there's some discrimination going on against, right? I've seen that, right? Or maybe a men's coach, we could actually get some, in a way, employee discrimination. Right? So what's that going to look like? So I'm kind of doing a review of some of the things that were in the other video, but in a slightly different context. Okay. So let's say we're thinking about women's basketball coaches, and we have male coaches and female coaches. Okay. So let's say we've got the demand for labor. And let's say employers, like the teams, are not discriminatory, and that consumers are not discriminatory. So the demand curves are exactly the same, right? For fans, for employers, they don't care if the coach is a male or female. They just care if they're bringing in a high number of additional wins, right? So we could then think about, all right, I've got my supply curve for labor, right? And let's say this is the supply curve for kind of female coaches, and it's exactly the same as male coaches, right? We would expect wages to be exactly the same as well. However, what if female players don't want to play for a male coach, right? If that's the case, we have kind of employer discrimination. So if we're thinking about the players themselves, and college, so they're not necessarily getting paid, right? But the value to them, right? It's actually going to be more costly for them to play on a team that has a male head coach because they're discriminatory, or they don't like that, or they're discriminatory towards that. So what we have going on is, this was when we're thinking about the supply of labor from these players when they play for a male coach, right? It's going to incur this additional cost, right? This additional discriminatory cost, meaning that if we had a free labor market where college players got paid, so this is plus discrimination, quantity, what that should have been, right? We'll see that if the players are discriminatory, right? We have employee discrimination going on, then we might actually see fewer players kind of joining those teams that have male coaches. And if they were being paid a wage, they would require a higher wage. Now, they don't get paid wages necessarily. So if we think about another way of thinking, or another way of looking at this, if I were, let's say I don't know, this is what they're getting paid, right? The value of their scholarship, right? It's just this flat amount, right? So what we would expect is, because that wage, the colleges, well, they're not supposed to change it, right? The college themselves can't pay the player, right? And they're just having kind of the only value they can give them is this, these small stipends with a scholarship. We would expect to see, what do I want to call this? It's another way of looking at it. All right, we would see way more of these players join these female teams, female coach teams, as opposed to these male coach teams. There's another way of thinking about it, right? But generally, we kind of model this employee discrimination as a shift in the supply curve. We're not looking at college sports. We kind of think about the free and open labor market that would shift wages and quantities. If we had a college sport where we had wage fixed, well, that's just going to result in fewer female players wanting to play for that male coach, more of them wanting to play for the female coaches. I don't know if that's necessarily going on, but right, if we looked at some of the data, there is some evidence that male coaches are in fact paid a little bit less in women's basketball. Controlling for like all the other factors, right? The wins that the team got, what conference they're in, etc. And there's also some evidence, I think it was from Humphreys too. I couldn't find this paper, but I had it. I know that it exists. But that it's also for NCAA golf coaches as well. For whatever reason, male coaches are paid less when you can control for all their quality factors. So we could see discrimination, and it might go against what our natural inclinations is, which is generally think of gender discrimination as always kind of against females. We have some evidence that in some sports it also may work the opposite direction. Right? Regardless, we don't want it either way, right? We should be seeing wages where players, coaches, whoever it is, are being paid exactly whatever their value to that team is. Any questions on anything before we keep moving? You're going to switch gears a little bit. I actually, yeah, we'll go through this because I updated it all. So, we're going to go now talk about not professional leagues, but kind of collegiate leagues or amateur sports. Right? So the first, a lot of people think, the Olympics were the first amateur sports, people were just participating, but in fact they weren't. A lot of them were generally rewarded by the cities that they came from, whether with money, they trained full time. That was kind of their job, right? So American colleges, initially, one of the first sports that got really big, it was actually rowing or crew. I think it was, yeah, crew. And they started getting colleges were recruiting these crew members to come to their, like Princeton, Yale, come to their college and make their team better. Essentially, kind of treating it like it was like paying them to come, right? And so colleges didn't like this, and so they kind of put up all these rules about you can't pay players. And, now it's not really changing. The NIL stuff is not through the universities, right? It's through other companies, right? But kind of there's this push against kind of allowing these professionals to be in these collegiate sports, right? So generally, when we think about colleges, they operate very similar to non-for-profits, right? They do want to increase revenues and they do want to have investments, but for the most part, if they make more money, they generally spend it, right? And so even though the colleges might operate kind of like a non-for-profit, athletic departments may not, right? The athletic departments may generate a high amount of profits, and then the university takes some of that and spends it on other things, right? So we might actually see them these athletic departments operate more like professional teams. Okay? So if we just kind of look at some of the numbers, it's kind of interesting. And I grabbed these. This was from 2022, most recent data. The top 5 revenue football programs, kind of what you would expect. Profits are a little bit different because even though I'm generating a lot of revenue, if I spend a ton of money, I may not be having as high of profits, right? We can kind of see here, we got a really big range, right? 161 million in Texas, because Dayton has got the lowest at 167,000, right? So what is this going to cost, right? If we think about companies wanting to give NIL money, what problem might this result in? What might be an issue that results of allowing these NIL payments?
Skews competitive balance even worse.
Yeah, right. Anyone who's going to Texas, right? There's, their value is a lot higher, right? They're generating a lot more revenue. So we would expect the demand to be much higher and the NIL money be much higher for those players. We're going to attract more of those high quality players. These already higher quality, high revenue generating programs, making competitive balance even worse, right? You can also look at kind of some of the basketball data. It's a little bit more interesting, get a little more shuffle around and who's generating the most profit versus the most revenue. But once again, pretty big range, not quite as big of a range in football. In fact, what's interesting is like the lower, the floor, right, for basketball a little bit higher, but the ceiling is quite a bit lower, right? So we have a little bit more of kind of a, less variation going on in college basketball revenue and profits. What's also kind of interesting, if we look at, and I'll show you the data here in a second. If we look at just kind of the averages, or kind of look at like what athletic departments are generating profit, which ones aren't. So the mean 7.6 million, but that is really skewed a lot. The median is actually 0. And we have what, 58%. So more than half of these football programs are actually just breaking even, right? They're just spending exactly how much they're generating. And then you've got what, 37% actually earning some profit, right? So, and that works out to be what, like 5%, I guess, would be earning negative profits, right? So they would actually be. So how could this occur? So how do we have some? Well, actually, before I talk about that, we'll look at basketball too. So just some of the numbers, right? So much lower overall mean. We have more programs, higher percent were earning 0, and fewer percent were actually generating a profit, which in turn means we also have a higher percent of these programs with negative profits. How can these programs operate with negative profits? Yeah. So it could be that it's more profitable to stay open, right? In the short run, right? If I'm at least covering, if I'm covering my fixed costs. In the long run, there's actually a solution as well where they could still operate with negative profits. So remember, the athletic departments are part of the university as a whole. So if my football program is earning negative profits, if I take money elsewhere and give it to the program so they can break even, right? That doesn't show up in their revenue, right? It's going to show up on the university's overall revenue and expenses, but it won't show up in the athletic departments. So what's true is, I'm not 100% sure on this. I think it's true about Ball State, but it's true about a lot of other universities. Is part of your tuition actually goes to subsidies for some of the athletic programs. Okay? So I've got this data, and it's older because it was from something that was only released every 5 years, and then the COVID year they haven't released it yet. So I've got 2010 and 2015 data, but you can kind of see. This is just for football, but they broke down their revenue into all these different categories. So the interesting one here is going to be student fees. So this is like how much money was coming from student tuition to funding these programs. You'll notice there's some zeros in there, like, but there's also some really large numbers as well. In fact, let's just play around with this for a little bit. I have both years in this data set. Let's just go to 2015. Let's go to student fees. All right, so Old Dominion's like really subsidizing their programs. You got a lot of the max schools in here, right here. All right, so yeah, they're taking a lot of money, right, from you, giving it to the programs. Right? So, and this is specific to the football programs. Right. I doubt it's as prevalent as in lower revenue generating sports, but for men's basketball, and I don't have the data on men's basketball, but I have to assume it's a very similar story here, right? Probably to a lesser degree. But then you kind of see, if I flip it around, when we're looking at these really high revenue generating programs, oh, lo and behold, they're not taking any student fees for them, right? So I don't know. This is a question that's kind of outside the scope of this class of whether, what's the morality of this versus, should we be doing this? Should we be able to opt in, opt out? But it is something that occurs. So where am I at? And some of them do, I should also mention. So notice here, like some of them, even though they don't do it through student fees, there are universities like they still take money from other areas of the university and give it to the athletic program. So these subsidies would be just money that's a similar way given to the athletic department, but just doesn't come from student fees. I put this up on Canvas if you guys want to take a look at this and play around with it. There's actually like some, let me see, what was the school funds? There was something else I thought was interesting here. So we got some ticket sales. This is kind of interesting how much revenue is generated from ticket sales. And then, oh, this is the other one. If we look at contributions, I guess this isn't probably the most prevalent, but I think it's interesting. Yeah.
I was gonna say, don't most of the ones who charge the zero student fees, do they still charge like students to get in the games?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, they're just not taking it from tuition, right? Yeah. I mean, you can still think about, it's not like you're attending the games for free. They're actually generating, it would be a little bit different, right? They're generating revenue in a different way. It's not through tuition, it's just through student choice. But at least that's an opt-in thing, right? The student fees coming from your tuition, I guess it's opt-in that you chose to go to the university, but it's not opt-in in the sense that you could have a choice. Also, I think contributions, that's what I was getting at. This is wild. I can't remember the guy's name, but there is a reason why A&M has the highest contributions from alumni. It's some really rich guy, and I forget exactly what he did, but I mean, I think it's 92 million. Yeah, $92 million in 1 year of contributions to the athletic department. And you can look at different universities here as well. Actually, probably interesting just to know what Ball State's is. See how stingy the Ball State alumni are. Yeah, 650,000. I mean, for a max school, that's not, I would expect it maybe not to be quite as high. But yeah, kind of an interesting data set. Like I said, I wish the newer data was out, but I only have the 2010, 2015 data. But it tells a similar story, right? Some of the universities will probably just change. So go back here. This is just some of the, I already pulled out some of this. So we had license revenue. We already kind of looked at the data. But what's this going to cause a problem? Right? If I have ticket revenue being 63 million for the highest school, 488,000 for the lowest, got licensing revenue, 62 million versus about 2 million, right? What's this gonna, what could cause a problem here? I'm gonna see competitive balance kind of be an issue, right? I've got a wide variety in how much revenue these programs have. This is specific to football. And so that means if I have less money to spend on recruiting, I'm less likely to get higher quality athletes. I have more money to spend on facilities, I'd be more likely to get high quality athletes. And so these differences in licensing revenue are going to be huge. Broadcast revenue, we kind of a similar story. All the major conferences now have their own network. So they're going to be generating a lot more revenue from their broadcast rights as opposed to kind of these smaller conferences who don't have their own networks. You got some teams who even have their own specific, I guess the Longhorn Network is a thing, right? Notre Dame kind of is an independent university, so they've signed their own broadcast rights. So it's going to even cause competitive balance to get even worse, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit, but we also see bowl games and NCAA tournament success are actually, those teams are actually rewarded. So the idea is that if you're in the tournament more, right, or if you're in the tournament or you're winning more in the tournament, you're generating more revenue for the NCAA. And so we'll give some money to you as a result of that. Now, it's not just to the team, it generally goes back to the entire conference. Right? So you think about, I'm going back to broadcast, I might have these out of whack, but just to here's this. I mean, these are the numbers on just broadcast revenue, right? So these different Power 5 that have their own broadcast right or broadcast deals on networks, they're generating a lot of money, right? So it's going to cause them to probably rise above the non-Power 5 conferences. Skip down to here. Yeah. So the last deal I could find a real solid number on was the 2010 deal. Actually, 14 years, so it should be coming up ending soon. But they signed a what, $10.8 billion deal. The NCAA did for the NCAA tournament, right? So the broadcast rights to that. 90% of their total revenue comes from these broadcast deals for the NCAA tournament. It's because if you look at the numbers, I mean, the TV viewership is insanely high, right? They're generating a lot of additional revenue, so these companies, these networks really want to have those games because they can sell a lot of ad space, right? Is this going to help competitive balance that we have these huge kind of contracts signed? So with the NCAA tournament, right? Let me say, there we go. I'll come back to this. But every single team that makes it simply gets 1.5 million. So how is this going to benefit competitive balance specifically if it operates through the NCAA tournament? So what's one of the features of the NCAA tournament? Like what's something that everyone likes? Every conference gets at least one. Yeah, there's automatic bids. So these lower kind of revenue generating conferences are guaranteed to get someone in there, guaranteed to get more money. Yeah.
Does it still count if you lose in the plan? Like, do you still get 1.5?
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know how to operate. I would imagine it's probably the play-in teams are also awarded the money. I don't know how it operates for the play-in team. That's a very good question. Yeah, I actually don't know that. You have an answer.
Like I know, like some conferences, like their team gets put in.
Yeah. I would. Yeah. So I guess out of fairness, I would assume that they give it to every single team. I'd have to look. I'll have an answer Wednesday. I'll poke around a little bit. But yeah, these automatic bids are guaranteeing that these lower kind of quality programs are getting, $1.5 million as well. And why is so? So if everyone's getting 1.5 million, right? There's an automatic bid even from the big conferences. So why would that help competitive balance? So if we think about, my Zoom thing there? There we go. So if I've got 1.5 million given to a small program, 1.5 million given to a large program. Let's say the large program is already earning $50 million in revenue, and they're spending it all, and the other program only has 10 million, right? What's true about that 1.5 million, the larger team?
Less utility.
It has a higher marginal value, right? As I have more money, each additional dollar is worth less and less to me, right? The first million, man, I can, get some pretty nice facilities. I can get some on recruiting. The next million, well, I can make my facilities better, but it's not really going to draw in. Once they're already nice, another 1.5 million. How much? It's not going to be a pretty marginal increase. So, because I'm giving this lump sum amount to those automatic bid schools, that's going to have a much higher value to them, or much higher utility, if you want to think about it that way, than it will to these larger programs. So it's going to help improve competitive balance that way. Let me see here. And then not only does the team that makes it get that 1.5 million, the conference gets an additional $250,000. So once again, how is this going to help competitive balance? If everybody in the conference is getting more money, same kind of idea. The automatic bids, these smaller conferences, they're getting this $250,000. Well, that's going to, be worth a lot more to them than it is to University of Michigan or one of these major universities, right? Although the more teams that you have kind of make it, that is 250,000 for each one, and so that's not going to help competitive balance because we see some of the larger Power 5 conferences that are actually getting more money, right? And I already talked about the marginal effect, so it's going to help the smaller conferences a little more. We can kind of look at this. I didn't update this this following year. I couldn't find a good succinct thing. I didn't want to go through every single team and count it up.
But you kind of see like, we have a lot of, some conferences that are way more represented. We have some where they're just getting the automatic bid team.
Where we at? So. Go back here. Skip something that I wanted to talk about. Oh. We're gonna talk about this now.
Similar kind of thing with the college football playoff, and also bowl games. So every team gets $6 million just for making it into the college playoffs.
And then conferences receive amount of money for every bowl game they're in, right? So let me see, what's the amount? I forget now. I'm skipping ahead here for a second. Did I not put the amount in here? I can't remember exactly. Okay,
I'll have to look that up too. So I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but when teams make a bowl, the conference that team is from gets a bowl game gets a certain amount of money. I can't remember exactly what it's off the top of my head.
It says here it's 2.08 for major bowl games to cover expenses. So
I guess there's the number. I guess I was overlooking it. Why is this going to maybe not be great for competitive balance? Right? If I'm giving money to conferences for every team that they have in a bowl game, what conference is going to get the most? Your big Power 5 conferences, right? So they're going to have more revenue. What can they do? Spend more money on facilities, recruiting, get even better, right? So we're going to have kind of a cross conference competitive balance get even worse, right? However, within conference, because the money isn't given directly to the team for making the bowl, it's the conference receiving it, and the conference shares it evenly. What's going to happen to within conference competitive balance? So if you think about like the Big Ten, more likely most years, Ohio State, Michigan are making the bowl games. Who am I going to pick? Northwestern probably doesn't make it, it's not right, but this helps kind of raise up that floor of your conference, right? Because it's money is spread equally, so your smaller kind of revenue generating, smaller quality programs are able to then, that money is more valuable to them. Same kind of idea with the NCAA tournament, and it should make within conference competitive balance better. Right? So what would we expect kind of if this is, if the NCAA continues to operate this way, where they give money to the conferences for the teams that they get in? Well, we expect that the Power 5 conferences competitive balance might get better, right? So one that you might see Northwestern in some of these better bowl games, but across conference competitive balance, the Power 5 schools are going to be way better than non-Power 5, right? Which, we look at this, kind of argue what's happening, right? If you look at some of these beginning of the season games, right? They're very lopsided scores, right? The Power 5 playing these non-Power 5 conferences, there's not a lot that can compete, right? And I don't know. I mean, I don't think you're going to change anytime soon, but this is what we see, right? Across conference competitive balance get worse, within conference competitive balance get better.
Didn't say that things like non-conference games, like the big schools and smaller schools kind of make up for that a little bit.
Well, yeah, if they're paying them to come play them, they're assuming they spend that money on their program. Yeah, that should help, but there's not a requirement for that, right? It's just it's usually like there's demand, right? So it would be like there's a value to the Power 5 conference team to having an easier game, right? So it's almost like a free market in the sense where there's going to be teams competing for that, and they're going to choose the person that wants to charge them the lowest amount, right? But you're right. If we do see that occur, that should help alleviate some of those competitive balance decreases across conference. Any other questions?
I don't know if I want to dive into this too much.
So this is a little bit older data as well, but it was kind of verified, so that's why I'm using it. You kind of see, I mean, the bowl payouts, you go down Power 5, the Big East is doing all right,
right? And there's this huge jump, huge drop, right? So if we're gonna have this, system, we really are gonna expect to see kind of the Power 5, non-Power 5, really that gap is gonna widen, right? I mean, you've got more than a tenfold, amount of money here, going to the Power 5 versus the non-Power 5. Let's just spitball here for a couple minutes. So what's a way that they could help alleviate some of these competitive balance issues with awarding bowl money? If you were going to do it, what would maybe be a more optimal way to kind of improve competitive balance by awarding bowl game money? So what's something I could do that kind of mimics the NCAA tournament? Maybe if I had some bowl games where it was the winner of each conference would guarantee a spot here. And then, right, that's actually hoping that, well, even though it's not as high quality of a conference, I'm getting the best team from that conference. So that game, right, for the competitive balance should be a little bit better. So I shouldn't be losing a lot of revenue by doing that, right? Because the uncertainty is still going to be relatively high. And then that team, if I'm getting money to their conference, going to have, almost like an automatic bid system, right? Where then they're going to get the same amount of money as these larger schools that are going to bowls. I think they did this. They used to kind of do this with even the Power 5, where like the winner of the Big Ten played this. Yeah.
The Rose Bowl's probably Pac-12 Big Ten.
Yeah. The problem is, right? At least I'm not aware of that occurring for some of our lower conferences. But if we had some of those bowl games set up like that, that should help kind of alleviate some of this concern.
Isn't whoever wins the MAC, isn't it the auto bid into like the Barstool Bowl or whatever they call it now?
I guess they might have a system that's set up for some of these schools, or some of these conferences. And it also probably varies a little bit. I don't think you have as many conferences represented in football because there's a lot of D1 universities or some that don't have a football program. But yeah, the other thing we can think about is not just kind of having this automatic bid system. But what if I just, well, we can pull that in this one. We'll start thinking about ways in which we could award bowl game or NCAA tournament money and how we impact competitive balance on a variety of different levels. So we'll now not just be talking about overall competitive balance, we'll be talking about across conference, we'll be talking about within conference, and sometimes different ways of awarding the money might have different impacts on within conference competitive balance in the Power 5 versus within conference competitive balance in the non-Power 5. So we'll start kind of thinking about different ways of payment there. We'll eventually kind of look into setting up a system and thinking about NIL money where players are being paid at the college level and how that is going to impact things like competitive balance. So that's kind of the direction that we're going. We'll pick back up on this on Wednesday. If you have any questions on that homework, I have to change my office hours today. So I'll be adding office hours later in the week. So instead of 2 to 4, Wednesday, Thursday, I'll be here from 2 to 5. So kind of each one of those days, extending an hour. If you have questions though, you can email me. Other than that, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.